All right, if you're just joining us, welcome to the discussion session on public banking. Feel free to use the chat box right now to introduce yourself and say where you're calling in from. Perfect. All right, well, I'm excited to welcome Marybeth Riley Gardam and Rickey Gard Diamond. Marybeth is the chair of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom US's Committee on Money, Women and Democracy. And Rickey is a Miss Magazine columnist and the author of the award-winning book, Screwnomics: How the Economy Works Against Women and Real Ways to Make Lasting Change. And before we get started, some tech logistics. Closed captioning is available. You can click on the CC Live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to enable the captions. You can also click on that button if you want to disable the captions. And again, please note that captions are done by robots, so please excuse any errors. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Marybeth and Rickey.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting us to present this evening. Rickey and I are humbled to be included in such a remarkable collection of peace activists, strategists, and experts. The Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, U.S. section, WILF, is the world's oldest international women's peace organization. But since our founding in 1915, we've done a lot more than just work for peace. We've been connecting human rights and economic justice to the roots of war and conflict. In this session, we're going to talk about what kind of just transition we envision and how to keep millions of dollars from Wall Street banks that invest in endless war, because it's just so darn profitable. Our issue committee, Women, Money, and Democracy, envisions a world economic system that promotes a more equitable, caring economy. We envision a vibrant, participatory democracy where the common good of the people is prioritized over profiteering and the consolidation of power, and one that offers a collaborative feminist model that values caring communities. If you're interested in learning more or joining our Women, Money, and Democracy Committee, contact me at wmad@wilfus.org. I think if you raise that slide up, you might be able to see that. Maybe not.
No, I guess not. I guess I'll step in here to talk about some basics.
Well, in addition to our long-standing pro-democracy work on corporate power and reversing corporate personhood, our committee increasingly also looks at monetary policy as it affects democracy, and in an effort to give women more of a voice on economic equity and affirm their place at the heart of economics. Rickey.
Okay, thanks. It's really great to be here. I appreciate it. And we're going to talk about a few things that don't usually get mentioned when economics is the subject. And that is that we want to, that women did not invent this economy or its tools or its rules. The patriarchy did. And that means most men didn't create this either. But our present economy is the product of a man-to-man discourse that is about 2,400 years old. About the time when that word you see there, oikonomia, was coined. It literally means household management, because that's where the economy was located in those days. But you can see from this graph here that the story that gets told about our evolution looks more like this. And of course, making lots of money is the ultimate goal. But now we're going to tell you a more gendered story. And it's a bigger story about Homo sapiens economy. This is the Venus of Willendorf, about 30,000 years old. carved with stone tools from a woolly mammoth tusk during the Ice Age. This one is Neolithic series, who you can see she's holding a sheaf of wheat here. That's when about 8,000 years ago, agriculture was discovered by women who had been gathering and carrying seeds and that sort of thing, and they are widely considered to have invented agriculture. And then this last figure, of course, you're more familiar with. She's not even 250 years old when she came after the colony's richest men declared independence from King George while holding slaves, killing natives, and marrying women whose rights and property became his under common law. That same year, 1776, was when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, which is widely considered to be the founding of modern economics, also called classic economics, to demonstrate how economics is often made hard to understand and confusing. 100 years later, all women had gotten for their trouble was this statue. They wouldn't become citizens for another 45 years. So what did women contribute to our economic evolution? Well, this is a picture of her weaving, her spinning cords and learning how to weave them and creating these wonderful stone looms, which you can imagine the Ice Age without that invention. This one is a wood-fired outdoor clay oven where she learned how to make pottery, first of all, so she could store the extra grain that was coming, making is made available through agriculture, and then also baking bread, which was kind of a important staple. This is a very recent invention. The circular saw was invented by Tabitha Babbitt, who attached it to her spinning wheel and invented it and revolutionized the saw. By then, men had mechanized women's textiles and were cooking food in tin cans, transforming her economic efforts from being a producer to becoming a consumer. But here's the key takeaway. For all of those years, women were the first property. Their labor and their reproductive powers were controlled by force, law, religion, custom, as wives, concubines, and slaves. All of that was the foundation of every so-called civilization and its wealth accumulation. So rape and control of women's bodies is still weaponized and used to control and devalue whatever is female. Here's more evidence for what we're talking about. In the left-hand corner, at least it's my left-hand corner, you see some cuneiform clay tablets. I don't know whether these are Sumerian or Babylonian, but this kind of accounting was the result of war making. We had to keep track of, or the kings and pharaohs had to keep track of who had won what booty and how it would be distributed. And so that's really how these forms of communication began to take place. That was their purpose, to keep things straight from war making and that kind of if you can't lick them, you got to beat them. So in that Greek vase on the lower left-hand corner, you can see that women were part of that booty that was won in war making. Now, this is a vivid illustration of it. They were property. They were gains won in war. And in this famous statue on the right-hand side, you see it's called the Rape of the Sabines. The Sabines, this is a very famous foundational story for the Romans, whose neighbors would not allow them to marry their daughters. And so they did what men of ancient times often did, which was to steal women and take her for their own, because women's reproductive powers were essential for the populations you needed to wage war or to conduct agriculture. It was very intensive labor. So women were property. And we still have this, an echo of this in our lives today, because it is the father of the bride who gives her away to the groom, although it has different meaning today for us, but still its roots are very deep. This is another picture of the rape of the Sabines, and you can see that the theme has changed a little bit. It's quite different. The Sabine woman is in the middle. There are several women there, and they're rather looking heroic. This was painted by Jacques-Louis David during the French Revolution, and its title is called The Intervention of Sabine Women, portraying her as courageous. So what had happened? What had made things so different by the time of the French Revolution? Well, women began reading in the 18th century, and that kind of changed a good many things. Not everything, though. We're still reading, but some things remain the same. Economics and war making remains very much a man's world. Money speaks in a male voice. The economy is very much waged as war. You can really see that evidence in what's been happening lately with the sanctions on Russia and in the Ukraine war. And it's still true that the bigger the pile of money, the fewer women are allowed. Now, women have now won the right to open a bank account. I don't know if any of you know what year that happened, that a woman could open a bank account without a male signature, or rather, a bank could no longer demand a male signature if she wanted to open a bank account. That happened in 1974, that recently. And today women work in banks and they might even manage a bank, but it's still very much the rules and the tools remain the patriarchies. Now, your father or your son or your brother might work in this world. He is not the economan that I'm talking about here. This character you see is named Blaise Bernays. His motto is, it's your right to profit, no matter who pays. He's a character from my book, Screwnomics, that my friend Pico Todd, the cartoonist, and I invented for my book. And so we're not talking about anyone working in this financial area being this economan, although there are possibly a few of those. But mostly we're talking about a mythical ideal where it's really it's really charming and to be a narcissistic sociopath as long as you have a good deal of money. He believes greed is good, and that's an idea we want to get away from. That's why we created an educational nonprofit called An Economy of Our Own. We have 3 levels of learning. I wish we could talk about this more, but I just want to introduce you to some conversations that we've been having among women, because women are still intimidated often by the subject of economics. There's a myth out there that women would rather talk about death than talk about the economy. We think it's more likely that women are discouraged from thinking about or talking among each other about the economy. So We have Zoom of our own conversations that introduce economic topics and new solutions that many women are already incorporating. Then we have conversations one-on-one with women to follow up in a more intimate and granular way on a particular subject. And learning circles are more intense workshop series on an economic solution, combining learning and action. So it so happens we have a survey up on our website, and later on you'll see how to locate the website, where we invite you to tell us what you'd like to learn about in a workshop. And I'll just remind you that we also have a giving circle that enables us to invest in bringing you women's voices on this important subject. You'll see all of our recordings are available on, we have a YouTube channel and also our webpage. And we talk about things like shared economies, how invisible caring is in this present economy, feminist economic future, creating money, and an eco-friendly economic difference. And you can see all of these on our webpage and on YouTube. But that's enough about us. Let's talk about what, excuse me. Let's talk about public banking, Marybeth, because our first learning circle was about public banking, because we'd had one Zoom of our own conversation that was so interesting. We decided we needed to create these more intense workshops called a learning circle.
Yes, you can see why Wilf's perspective and an economy of our own perspective overlap so well. And about 2 years ago, Wilf partnered with AEOO because their perspectives matched ours so perfectly. In our vision, Homeland Security includes a strong safety net of benefits for all: safe food, safe neighborhoods, safe and accessible voting. Our work gives women a voice in creating a democracy that works for all Americans, and an economy based on the values we hold, but are constantly told we can't afford. It's funny how there's always more money for more war. Our message is that our corrupt economic system is too often waged as war, domestically and across the world. It's never been designed to benefit women, their families, or Mother Earth. Our present money king-making system is being redesigned by those who have been most sidelined and thus have the most to gain by fixing it. You can see all of AEOO's conversations on their YouTube channel. And I've put the link to their resource page in the chat. We say in Women's Way of Knowing Money, we need not make a killing. In other words, our economy should not be used to oppress our own people or launch economic or military wars abroad. For too long, if you were in debt, you were told this was all your fault. And in fact, this rigged system is designed to keep most people in debt and moving added interest money upward to the wealthiest 1%. Public banking isn't the only economic innovation that WILF and AEOO have been promoting. We're also working with the Alliance for Just Money to lift up a monetary system reform that's not based on debt. But we believe public banking can address many issues while educating Americans on the current role of banks as money creators. Not many Americans understand that now, and it's a way of beginning to get people more comfortable discussing this subject. Public banking is a really good tool. So let's get down to what public banking is and why it matters to peace activists. A public bank is different from a big commercial Wall Street bank. It's owned by the people of a city, state, or region and charged with operating in the public interest, not for profit. Public banks can finance needs underfunded now, like the environmental protection, student loans, infrastructure, maintenance of public utilities, supporting equitable distributive energy solutions, small business loans for women, small businesses, and people of color. And importantly for this audience, while doing so will also divest public money from the war machine. Public banks have a long history and function all over the world. This map is from the Public Banking Institute, another partner in AEO's alliance. They are owned by cities or states, and they are capitalized or funded by the income that cities and states receive from taxes, fees, court costs, traffic fines, and all kinds of licenses that they issue. Maybe more importantly, public banks are chartered to operate in the public interest, not for profit, which is the driver of commercial and privately owned Wall Street banks, and even some local community banks. You'll notice that public banks are rare in North America. In other nations, public banks often include individual and family savings and checking accounts. But here in the US, most of the public banks being created are set up differently to hold only state or city-owned income from public funds. There's only one public bank in the continental United States, founded over 100 years ago in the state of North Dakota. It was founded by North Dakota farmers who were angry that Wall Street bankers were controlling commodity pricing and investment markets. They created winners and losers among them. Even though North Dakota is a very conservative state, the Bank of North Dakota is very popular, and for good reason. It acts as a sort of central bank for the state. It partners with local community banks and small credit unions so they can have the ability to make larger loans and more small business loans too, without constraints and high interest that big commercial banks typically put on those loans. So the smaller banks have more freedom to compete. The local money from North Dakota stays local, so it does not go to Wall Street. That means that money can be used to support local projects that people of that state really want. And because that money stays away from Wall Street, they also avoid the risks the private commercial Wall Street banksters have notoriously taken with other people's money. In 2008, in its aftermath, the state of North Dakota was the only state that did not experience huge foreclosure rates and financial losses, directly because it was insulated from the Wall Street risk, since it has its own state bank. Think of the trauma and heartache that saved families and businesses in North Dakota. Finally, they save money, a lot of money. Wall Street banks charge sky-high management and interest fees. They have to in order to be able to pay their CEOs and top management obscene salaries. Next slide. In 2014, the state of Arizona found it necessary to cut $300 million from their public education budget. One woman there, Pamela Hanley, was so incensed that she researched where her state spent its money. And what she found was pretty amazing. That same year, the state spent $312 million in interest fees alone at a Wall Street bank, just for them to hold and manage their money. So think about it, if every state in the United States hands over large sums of money like that to a Wall Street bank instead of keeping the money local and investing it in what people really want in their communities. What kind of numbers are we looking for? Looking at in a single year across the whole US, $160 billion leaves our states and goes to Wall Street. Even though in every state, there are plenty of projects that go underfunded. Infrastructure maintenance, roads and bridges, water infrastructure, bringing internet to rural communities, healthcare for uninsured, public education, arts education, green spaces, and so many hopes and dreams that just never seem to get off the ground. And what does Wall Street do with our public money? They invested in companies that offer the most profits without regards to consequences for people or planet. Industries like pipelines, oil drilling, mining, and fracking, and they invest in for-profit prisons and payday loan sharks, and in corporations that manufacture weapons and provide private security forces. Banks' biggest reliable profits come from the biggest government contractors, the war machine. Wall Street finances and owns stock in the aerospace, energy, mining, nuclear industries, and with interconnected ownership, banks can hold controlling interest in the same companies that they support with business loans. It's kind of like loaning themselves money. Here's a look at the banks who invest in pipelines. Just pipelines alone in the United States, never mind fracking and mining. This map is courtesy of the lastrealindians.com. It appears in our Wilf Public Banking Toolkit with their permission. You can't see all of the small names on our slide, but the biggest ones are enlarged. It feels like a big conflict of interest, doesn't it, that the creators of money for everyone, the commercial banks who own the Federal Reserve, are legally bound to assert their own profit before all else, and regardless of the consequences for people and planet. Now, let's look at some of the same banks and how they invest in weapons and war. These are the amounts listed in millions that a few banks, out of many, many, are investing in nuclear weapons and other weapons corporations, companies like Raytheon, Boeing, Aerojet, Lockheed Martin, Honeywell, General Dynamics, BAE, and Grumman, among others. Probably you all know these list of war profiteers better than I do. US banks and investment companies make money in many ways supporting these manufacturers and weapons traders. They underwrite, make loans, own shares in, and hold bonds for these huge companies. They brag about creating jobs, but at what cost? The list of US bank and investors that back war profiteers is extremely long and includes all the big payers and a lot of smaller ones too. Names like Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, huge investment partners like the International BlackRock and Vanguard, but also smaller names like Charles Schwab, Raymond James, TIAA, Thrivent Financial, Nationwide Insurance, State Farm Insurance, and Liberty Mutual. A single bank can have multiple ways that they support corporations. Morgan Stanley, for instance, in 2021 loaned out $4,498.8 million to war profiteers. That same year, they held shares in many of the same companies to the tune of $4,404.3 million. And they underwrote loans for them for $9,836.8 million. Just that one huge bank in 1 year investing $18,736.9 million in war and war profiteers. That's just one bank in 1 year. Those numbers are so big that I can hardly pronounce them. The amounts are unimaginable for most of us. You can find an in-depth list of investors in nuclear and other weapons at www.don'tbankonthebomb.org/investors. You can filter the list by nations of origin and click to find exactly which war profiteers are being supported by which banks and in what methods. If each year we deny that $160 billion in public money to those Wall Street banks, if we can keep that money in public banks, we can invest in the public interest instead of in war. We can help move the needle as we move the money from endless war towards peace. At least that's the idea. We're looking for more advocates among the peace community to get on the public banking wagon. And public banking is catching on. 18 legislative bills were introduced in 2021. It's advancing in California, which is blazing a path for the rest of the country. They have 4 viable startups led by cities and regions. It's active in Massachusetts, New York, and the city of Philadelphia. People are beginning to have hope that their future can indeed be funded by the very communities they want to serve and the ones they live in. At AEOO, we've co-sponsored with WILF partnered learning circles and Zooms of our own. And we're encouraging women, not just the usual suspects, but a broad array of women to connect the dots from the kind of world they want and how to get there. We're personalizing and adding detail to the work of the Public Banking Institute. And by the way, PBI's new website offers an activist toolkit to start taking the dialogue about public banking to your local farmers market, environmental event, women's gathering, or economic development event. It offers wonderful brochures, display, and talking points. Look, there are a lot of great materials out there about public banking, and we encourage you to check them all out. 3 years ago, our WILF committee began collecting these resources in an anthology document we call WILF's Public Banking Toolkit. It's available for free at our website. It includes links to much of the information available. It's about 45 pages, including an appendix with talking points and sample resolutions, and links to all sorts of other resolutions. But it's a whole lot shorter than a 900-page book. We've given you a lot to think about, but before we sign off, here is a short and inspiring video of California Public Banking Alliance activist and organizer Trinity Tran, talking about why she is so invested in this effort. She really says it a lot better than I can. I'm just going to share my screen for a second. You have to stop sharing yours, Rickey.
Okay, let's see.
Oh, I think I can do it. There you go.
Okay, good.
Okay. Let's make sure. Let's make sure I did the sound. Yep. Okay.
All right, well, welcome everyone. I'm Trinity Tran with the California Public Banking Alliance, and I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the incredible work of the volunteer activists of the public banking movement. When we set out on this mission over 3 years ago, we envisioned a network of public banks in California, deeply rooted in our communities, that would use public funds the way they should be used, not for private gain, but to address the needs of the people, to fund sustainable projects, and reinvest wealth back into our streets. We took this vision, we built a movement, and in one legislative session, we turned a policy into a law. And now from the state level to the city level, Alliance activists and legislators are working together to move motions and resolutions forward up and down the state. So this is an incredible moment to see our vision come alive. The elected officials in this town hall represent some of the largest economic power centers in the nation, cities that are taking concrete steps to create responsible and accountable public banks. And it takes real leadership to trailblaze and design a new institution that will one day transform the social and economic landscape of this country. So we commend the speakers here today for helping to lead the way. This is a defining moment, not for public banking. This is a defining moment for public banking and for the future and the evolution of finance. A better world is not only possible, it's unfolding as we work to build a new community-led and human-centered system. So I thank all of you for joining us and supporting our work. For those who are new, welcome to the movement. And with that, I'll hand it over to David Cobb,
Trinity was making that announcement at the beginning of a nuts and bolts conference that was held earlier this year in California and across the nation. When we talk about just transition in moving the money from war to peace, public banking has to be a major strategy for divesting from Wall Street and diverting public money to the kind of world we really want to see, a more caring economy, a more people-centered country. Thank you for your interest. Rickey and I are available to take your questions. I think there are probably some in the chat.
Thank you so much, Marybeth and Rickey. Yes, we have a little bit over 30 minutes, almost 40 minutes for Q&A and discussion. And this is set up as a meeting so people can, raise their virtual Zoom hands and we can call on you and unmute you. And there's a few questions in the chat I can start with. Well, I guess one question is if you could speak more to, the process of actually enacting a public bank. I know there's the California campaign. I know there's the successful, I think, Philadelphia City Council resolution. So what does that process look like?
It can look different in different locations is kind of the answer that we've been told. We've been working with Susan Harmon from the Public Banking Institute, and she tells us that it looks different in Los Angeles than it does in Sacramento, in San Francisco, and again, different in Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, it started with at the city level, and they just recently had their city council approve their effort to take this next step to take it to their legislature, their state legislature. In California, they started, I think at the state level, wasn't that right, Rickey?
Yes, there's state legislation in California, but the way it's implemented might be quite different from other states. In other words, there's such a huge state, they've decided to create several regional banks, and that requires a lot of cooperation with different counties and municipalities, and it's pretty complex. So the legislation was passed nearly 2 years ago now, I think, and they're still in the development stage, even though they've got the legislation behind them.
They're capitalizing the banks now, and the way they do that is they use the income from the state with the city, like I said, in terms of taxes that come in, licenses and fees, parking tickets, court costs, all of that. Even some states use their employee pension plans as a way to capitalize the state bank. And the Massachusetts state bank, public bank that's in the offing, is they submitted a piece of legislation that is being reviewed by the state legislature. And I think the finance committee possibly.
Yes,
But-
it's a long haul usually. This isn't a sprint, it's definitely a marathon. And Massachusetts is a good example of that because they actually had another piece of legislature that was rejected, and they've revised it some, and now the Boston Globe has come out and acknowledged that it was rejected before, but now they're thinking that it's a good enough idea that they're endorsing it. So behind that endorsement is a lot of other work involving other people who have written letters to the Boston Globe or who have, spoken to any number of groups. In California, for instance, how many endorsers did they have for their legislation, Marybeth?
It's like 186. I mean, huge
Yeah.
numbers.
Yeah, a lot of on-the-ground work explaining what public banking is and how it might benefit what passions you have in your region. It could be green energy. It could be student loans, affordable student loans. It could be small business development for communities of color. It could be any number of things. But what's remarkable is that a public bank is far more transparent and far more accountable than Wall Street is. In fact, a lot of citizens have never really stopped to think. I know I was one of those citizens who had never stopped to think about, oh, where do they put our state's money? And it's not always easy to discover that either. I come from Vermont, and in Vermont, there's a 200-page financial document that reports on all of this information, but you need a good translator to understand what it is. Interestingly, I asked my friend who worked with the auditing department, how many legislators did she think were familiar with that 200-page document? And what do you think she said? Hardly any. Even people who are even legislators who are on the financial committees aren't intimately familiar with that document. And this is the way big banking operates. I don't want to apply motivations to someone when I don't know the people involved personally, but I think overall it's fair to say that keeping the details obscure is part of the way they operate.
Yeah, how many people had heard of the Bank of North Dakota, even though it's been around for 100 years? There has to be a reason.
Yeah.
They haven't told us much about it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Somebody asked if this was a politicized issue. And to some degree, I imagine everything today is a politicized issue, but I also think that if you can talk to people about this in a way that stresses the security of a public bank and cite the lack of losses in North Dakota in 2008, the lack of foreclosures, the security of deposits, that would convince people. If you can stress the local control, which is a big Republican issue, that could also help. So I think there are ways to approach it. And in our learning circles, we've really tried very hard to get our participants to think about the best way to approach this. And we asked them to start with local allies and activists like the peace community, the environmental allies, people who have a lot to gain by keeping money local and away from those Wall Street banks. And if you do that first and concentrate on developing that long list of allies and endorsers before you ever start meeting with legislators, you won't be going in there as a lone maverick with some crazy idea about public banking. You'll have a whole lot of other constituents behind you.
Wonderful. Yeah, we have Simri with a hand up. Simri, you can now unmute.
Hi, great presentation. It's so interesting. I'm in Canada, so of course, right away, I'm wondering if there's equivalent. I know WILP is very active in Canada too. Is there an equivalent kit here in Canada as well, or would we have to do some kind of adaptation of starting with the US?
I think the laws might be quite different in Canada,
Yeah.
but I think our toolkit might be a good place for you to start reading about how it works and what the benefits are, and developing, using the talking points we provide.
It is. It's very exciting because right now there's a huge campaign that Lead Now and Council of Canadians and many other community groups are working to try to get the banks to divest from fossil fuels, because we have pipelines all over the place here in Canada, as you know, and mining companies. So we're trying with RBC to chase them down to get them to stop investing in fossil fuels. And if people had an alternative where they could say, wow, there's a public bank, you can just put your money there. I'm wondering also, and I won't want to dominate, so I'm just going to, one last question. Is this similar to postal banking? Because I've been hearing for a long time about there's a whole movement to have postal banking, whereas the post office would be like a local community bank. Or is that something else?
No, postal banking is an example of public banking, and I'm happy to say that the Public Banking Institute, whose webpage we shared in one of our slides, we can put it in the chat too, has a section on postal banking, which is
okay. So it is,
another form. There are several ways to do this, and all of them would be better than working only for profit.
Yes, it's a great presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful. There was also a question in the chat about, can you explain the difference between public banking and credit unions?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, credit unions are certainly smaller community banks that you become a member, and so you have a voting power, and they're certainly more transparent than a big Wall Street bank. So if you have a local credit union, by all means, talk to them about public banking and your interest in divesting from Wall Street if possible, and also you can, if you study up on what's happening in North Dakota, you can encourage them to be supportive of public banking, because what North Dakota's bank does is back smaller banks. In fact, there are more small banks in North Dakota because there's a Bank of North Dakota public bank. They make it possible for credit unions to compete and take on loans that otherwise they might not be able to, because of the backing and the guarantee of the Bank of North Dakota. So,
but a state would never be able to keep all of its public money in a credit union. It's just too much money.
Yeah,
for a single credit union to handle.
Right. Which is why Wall Street banks often are the ones that are holding the state's revenue, because those amounts are so large.
They want that money badly.
They do.
Wonderful. Yeah, there were a few sort of questions and comments about, this seems really great, but it also seems kind of daunting. Do you, what's the first step that you recommend?
Well, in beginning to talk about it, beginning to study up on it, one of the things that WILP and AEOO are trying to develop in the coming year is a kit so that you could start your own learning circle in your own community and study together. This is definitely a subject that is friendlier if you've got people you can talk to about it who aren't going to roll their eyes when you bring up the subject, you know. So finding some friends to study up on it with is a good place to begin. So no doubt you have activist friends who are frustrated about what they can't find financing for. Why can't we afford this? And the way to begin is not to think about banking, which many people have, you know, unhappy associations with, and instead think about the things that you really want to be able to afford. A public bank can make that dream come true. So focus on that for starters.
And also, if you begin to talk about this and feel comfortable talking about it in circles, you'll find that people you know people who make decisions about these kinds of things. One of our the Public Banking Institute leaders mentioned it at a cocktail party where someone who knew the governor was there and immediately brought it to the governor's attention. And now there's a public banking effort going on in New Jersey. Being able to get this information into a wide variety of ears, and then the ears of people in your community who are connectors or influencers, that's really important. And also at the same time, like Rickey said, getting to be familiar enough with the information so you can answer questions or direct people to where they can find answers.
I guess we should mention Pamela Hanley again, who in Arizona, she was, you know, an active citizen, but after she discovered this and the cuts in education that matched the amount that was being spent for debt service to a Wall Street bank, she became passionately involved, became a board member of the Public Banking Institute, and ultimately ran for a local office and became a legislator in her own state, where she still is a legislator. Now, she hasn't won the bank yet, but she's certainly in a position to do much more and to make it more possible for Arizona.
Right. I think that's a good point. It was that story about Pamela Hanley was what really got me interested in public banking 3 years ago when I read Rickey's book. And it was just such a stupendous revelation and connection that they were cutting the budget by 300 million and spending 312 million on interest. It just, I mean, think about all the other things that get cut in various states because they have to pay these stupid fees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you think about your own financial relationship, if you bought a house, you're paying double what the house is actually, what the mortgage is, and that interest payment is going right up front. That's the most important thing as far as the bank is concerned. So it kind of works that way for state money as well. And because a state is managing its money in a way similar to the way a small business has to manage its cash flow, it might need to take out, you know, short-term loans to get through those thin spots, which, you know, is something businesses do all the time. States do that too. And so most of us haven't thought about our state's money, our public money in this way before. We've been discouraged from thinking about it because, oh, well, the bankers are going to take care of all of that, and they do. But there are ways for us to cut our costs as a state in the same way that, no, not in the same way that businesses do, because businesses do need banks to function, but it could be a lot more affordable for all of us if we kept it local and we made it public and transparent. And more people understood what was at stake, were encouraged to think about what's at stake. We've got another raised hand here from Colin.
Yeah, this is just a note. I'm speaking from Canada, from Victoria in British Columbia. I'm sorry. I'm really supportive of where you're going with this, but I'd just like to note two concerns. There are a number, but two major concerns. In Canada, the Desjardins cooperative or credit union cooperative in Quebec is probably in size is probably much larger than the North Dakota Bank, for example, but it is perceived as a citizens bank. Similarly, on the West Coast in Vancouver and British Columbia, we have Vancouver City Trust, which are also community banks. And as you go across the country, you see a whole range of smaller but similar kinds of coalitions of credit unions historically, which have turned into banks. The problem is that the larger they get, the question of governance comes up. And in effect, they become embedded in what is already the larger, more dominant, in the US, you'd say Wall Street, in Canada, we would talk about Bay Street. They become engaged in that fundamental capitalist ideology. And that's problematic because staff of these credit unions, even of Van City or Desjardins, are trained in conventional economics. They think in that mode. And this becomes particular. They may not invest in pipelines or in defense industries, and I give them full credit for that. I don't want to pull them down completely. But when it comes to something like consumption and consumer loans, which in effect are no different than the banking, then that's where you run into problems, is the question of governance and the question of the general habit of consumption and so on in the society generally. I pose those as two kind of problems there without trying to denigrate, and I'm fully supportive of what you're doing, but historically this has been a huge problem in terms of community and state banks and so on and so forth, that they get enmeshed in what is the larger Wall Street, let's call it ideology or processes or education. And it's just a kind of cautionary note that to maintain your strength and what you want to do involves some really serious education once you get started.
Well,
I'm not an expert, but I have had some dealings with cooperatives and cooperative education and so on. And I just like to
the model that's being pursued in California, which I think will really kind of, a lot of what they're putting in place will be the model for the rest of the country. They're fairly rigid about how the board of directors of the bank will work. They're hiring professional bankers to run the banks, and they're requiring a certain percentage of community nonprofits and community development professionals to be on the bank board to oversee who gets the loans and how it's handled. Now, we're not saying that there will never be any corruption, but it's up to the citizens themselves who are in charge of the bank to monitor that and make sure it doesn't happen. And can we really say that whatever they do will be worse than what we're seeing at the Wall Street banks now? Probably not.
Yeah. You know, I have to mention a video that we shared in our learning circle, and I don't have the link to share on the chat, but I know it's available, possibly through Susan Harmon, Marybeth. But it was a video sharing the former president of the Bank of North Dakota talking about something that I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They've been around for 100 years now. They don't pay the big bonuses that Wall Street banks do. I don't know how they find people to work for far less, people who want to work in North Dakota and operate a publicly, a bank with a public mission. But he talked about making loans available to people who couldn't afford them. These are business loans. And instead of operating in the way that typical banks do, if you have less money, say if to mortgage a house or to get a business loan, you can expect to pay a higher interest rate, right? But he was talking about the bank making it available at a lower interest rate, making those loans available at a lower interest rate, flying in the face of what is the norm. And it's happening at this bank in North Dakota that's 100 years old. So it is possible for, I don't know, what do you call such a person? A dreamer who wants to fly in the face of capitalist norms. It is possible, and it does happen. So
yeah, he also talked about the fact that most banks they await people coming to them with proposals for projects, whereas the Bank of North Dakota is now, after so many years in the state, in a position where they look for projects that will benefit a community or the state at large or a county, and they approach them and ask, how could we help you expand this idea if you had more money? Let us underwrite your project. What a novel idea.
yeah.
So we're not saying that this is going to stop war by any means. I'm sure that weapons manufacturers and dealers get all kinds of other income from the people who buy their merchandise. But if we can limit the amount of money they have to manufacture and sell those weapons, it seems like that would be a pretty good strategy for cutting down on the spread of this kind of conflict and endless war.
Yeah, one of the things that, as I say, I'm a member of Van City here and have always been a credit union member and so on. One of the things is that the citizens banks or community banks or national banks, however you want to describe them, credit unions, face is the national political scene. In other words, credit unions in Canada have faced some difficulty in that any bank has to receive a charter from the federal government. Now I'm talking about the Canadian scene. And often in the legislation enabling them, they will put certain constraints on citizen banks that they won't put on Wall Street banks, for example, or Bay Street banks, that you have a legislative prejudice, if you will, that constrains the credit unions. I'd like to hear how you might want to handle that difficulty, because ultimately it comes down to the politicians rendering a charter to the specific banks.
Well, we saw very much the same kind of lobbying by the Bankers Association during the 70s when the savings and loan crisis came up, and savings and loans had so aggressively campaigned to change the banking laws so that they could have banks across city and county lines in different states and create massive networks of power and influence where they had been restricted to be in a city or a state. So yeah, the same kinds of influence can be exerted. And we hear from our compatriots in California that the banking lobby is very strongly opposing their work out there, but they now have so many allies and endorsers working with them that legislators are finding it easier not to listen to the bank lobby, and are especially in some of the big cities making it possible for this to proceed. Rickey, do you want to comment on that?
Well, just that it isn't simple, and it's very localized. It differs depending on whether you're talking about credit unions or community banks, or Canada, or the United States. I guess I want to point also to the Landesbank system in Germany, which has a long history of very local investments that are even, those banks are, that system is even older and more complicated, and also probably responsible for a lot of the ability of Germany to bounce back after World War II. So what am I saying? I guess I'm saying that it's complicated, but it's also a hopeful pushback against what wants to create that war machine and wage an economy like war. There is a different kind of economy that's possible, and public banking is just one piece of that. So
it's also kind of an exercise in democracy.
Yeah.
I mean, you're forcing local people to come together to create something with a common vision, and that will truly, if executed as planned, benefit their entire community. And there's something wonderful about that. Rickey, why don't you talk a little bit about the struggle in Vermont?
Oh, yeah. Well, that was a good example of a lot of, in Vermont, we have what are called town meetings, and people, maybe democracy is still alive here in Vermont because of those town meetings where people get together and they talk about the school budget, and they feel responsible for the school budget, and they know the details, and they argue with each other about it. So the town meetings have, back in 2014, I think it was like a dozen towns decided to support public banking. And the duly elected state treasurer, who is very responsible and sensible and knew a great deal. She was a person who kind of was raised in the standard economic system that Colin was talking about, that has a certain attitude and certain connections and friends. And so she turned out, despite what town meetings and the general people wanted, there was an organization called Vermonters for a New Economy that was very supportive and very knowledgeable about public banking and pushing legislation. But the treasurer did not want those things to happen. And so she influenced a lot of people to think otherwise about public banking. And instead, she kind of came up with the idea of using the cash flow. She saw there was certain cash flow possibilities in Vermont to take some of the cash, some of the revenue of the state, and invest it locally. And so she kind of did a a very clever runaround about the whole idea of legislating a public bank, and kind of killed it. So nothing lasts forever though, and so she's not running again this year. And there's a whole new slate of people interested in. There's a new legislature. There's a new, a lot of new candidates doing a lot of different things. And so we have a clean slate again. And so now it's 2022, and we're beginning to organize to bring the whole prospect of a public bank to Vermont again, starting all over again. So that's a long process for sure. But in the same way that happened in Massachusetts, where the idea was rejected, now we've got the Boston Globe coming out in favor, and there's a new organization in Massachusetts. And a woman, actually, there are two women who were co-chairs in Massachusetts, Ruth Kaplan and Mia Evans, who they're movers and shakers. And the Globe just came out with an endorsement. So we're trying to do a similar thing here in Vermont. Now, will it work? I don't know. It's exciting.
What's really neat is that at our current learning circle, which we're on the 5th of 6 sessions, we noticed that there were 5 or 6 women from Vermont that just happened to join this learning circle. And they got so enthused about public banking that they formed this ad hoc committee and started going after the next person who's going to run for state treasurer. And they're organizing to make public banking part of that person's platform. I mean, there's a lot of potential.
Mm-hmm. And maybe we should mention Leah Bolger, who was part of our first public banking learning circle, and invited us to come here to this
Great
conference. Yeah.
And as Bruna said in the chat, having this kind of dialogue locally is an opportunity to get people to think about what they're spending their public money on. A public budget is a moral document, but most people don't ever think about it that way. But if they have to really think about, well, do they want their local public dollars to go to help the school system or the arts program or create more parks and rec? Or do they want it to fund more planes for Boeing or more drones for Lockheed Martin or more weapons for Raytheon? Then that's where the rubber hits the road. People really get to evaluate where they want their money to go. And even if they don't get the final decision on that, having the dialogue is so important for making people think in that way. They just aren't thinking that way.
No, they're not encouraged to think that way. They're not encouraged to think about it at all, right? So I see some people are talking about mutual aid, and Bernie Sanders working with national legislators to support postal banking. That's a national movement. And Bernie is in favor of public banking, as is
AOC.
AOC. and people are talking about public banking on a national level.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Marybeth and Rickey. We are just out of time. We can certainly stay on if people have any other lingering questions, but that is the official end of today's programming. And the expo booths are open now if people want to go to the expo area for a little bit. And then we will see everyone back tomorrow. And tomorrow we have many different sessions, but one of them is divestment and reinvestment strategy. So I think it will really pair nicely with this conversation and talking about different community investment strategies that could be done sort of in tandem with public banking.
Yeah,
Thanks so much for having us.
thank you very much.
And tomorrow I'm seeing questions in the chat. Tomorrow we start at 10 a.m. with expo booths. And then the first official panel starts at 10:30 a.m. Eastern time.
Great.
So thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.